High tech, low tech, or no tech. Through our hobbies and our passions, the geek comes out in us all.
The world's of geekdom.
I am a geek and am proud of it.
Geeks.
Geeks unite.
Well, let's get those nerds! Nerds! No!
Did you just call me a nerd?
Not all geeks are nerds.
Yeah.
This is Geek Therapy Radio.
What do we wait for?
And now your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger.
Okay, geeks, my guest in this first segment is so awesome. You're just going to have to indulge me as I tweak the intro here a little bit to put you in the mood for my amazing guest. Oh, this is so awesome. Just give me a minute here. Just give me a minute. I'll be right back. Welcome to Geek Therapy Radio. I am absolutely geeking out right now. I've got a very special guest. This man actually, I don't know if you know this special guest, but you inspired me to get into radio. One night, about 20 or so years ago, I was tuning through the dials because I wanted to hear something that wasn't music. I wanted to hear people talking. And who I heard coming through my little radio was George Noory. And I have George Noory on the show right now. George, how are you doing?
Johnny, so I was a geek and I turned you into one. Is that what happened?
That's exactly right. You didn't even know it, but you were talking to me. It felt like one-on-one, and you turned me into a geek. Absolutely.
Well, that's what I do. But, great radio is one-on-one radio. When you broadcast, never broadcast as if you're broadcasting to hundreds of thousands or millions of people. Just broadcast to one person, and you'll see better results that way. That's what I've done all my life.
That's really good advice. And sometimes when I'm doing the show, I've been doing it for a year and a half or so now, George. I know you've been doing it for quite a while. I don't want to. You're not that old. I'm just saying you've been at it longer than me.
I did talk radio right after Marconi invented radio.
Actually, do you know? I think wasn't there a guy in? There was a dispute over that patent, was there not? It was Marconi who gets credited for it, but apparently there's some hillbilly somewhere. I don't mean hillbilly in a negative connotation. It's actually ingenious the way he was inventing radio with what he had, but I guess Marconi got there first. Do you know anything about that?
I'm sure there's always been a squabble over who got what done quick. I was raised in Detroit, so all my life we were told Henry Ford invented the automobile. Mm-hmm. Well, he really didn't. The automobile was invented by Germans. Yeah. And, what he created was mass production.
Yes.
That's what he did, and he did that well.
Yes. Henry Ford created mass production. And the first automobile, late 1880s, I want to say. And interestingly, they were electric. The first cars were battery-powered. Did you know that? Yep,
they sure were. And then they started going into small little engines, and they did their thing. The Mercedes folks, Daimler Mercedes folks, took the idea from another individual who had already created an automobile, and then they did theirs, and off they went.
It really is kind of an amazing story. History is amazing like that, and it's kind of an understatement to say that geeks shape history. Without geeks, we wouldn't have cars or airplanes or someone with at that time, the audacity, a geek with the audacity to say, I can get a heavier than air machine into the sky. And then, meanwhile, everyone around you is saying that's absolutely impossible. There's a tenuous grasp on physics anyways. And getting something made out of paper and wood into the air is borderline impossible. But George, it's geeks. I don't want to say like you and me, who shaped the world.
It's a geek's world. Is a geek the same thing as a nerd?
No, I would say no. Geeks. One of the mottos of my show now is that I say geeks are sexy. It used to be, I don't know, when I grew up going to school, I had big glasses. I still have kind of thick glasses
and
now.
Did you have a pocket full of pens and pencils?
I did not. But I did have. I may have worn a pocket protector once or twice, but I didn't like the way it felt. I did go to a private school for some number of years, but they didn't have the breast pockets, so I couldn't go full nerd day to day there. But I was into a lot of things, and actually, and I don't want to take too much away from you're talking here, George, because you are the special guest. I used to sit there in church, actually in Catholic church, getting very bored and imagining flying machines. We used to get out of church and I'd tell my Mom, I think I figured out how to make a bicycle fly. I think if I just gear it up in a certain way and put a propeller, and God bless my mom, she never squashed that curiosity out of me. She was always like, well, do you want to go to the hardware store and buy some parts and maybe try to build that flying bike? So she didn't squelch that out of my life. Was there anyone in your life, George, who kind of encouraged you to pursue your geek passions?
Well, I did a lot on my own, but my mother was very instrumental in helping me with sports and learning how to play baseball and stuff like that. She would take me out into the backyard and pitch for me for hours and hours and hours and days. And then one day, I hit the ball over the roof of the house.
Wow.
And she said, "You're done. You've learned."
Yeah.
And, she signed me up for Little League, and that's what they did. Our parents have had an instrumental effect on our lives. I used to have chemistry set. My dad bought me a telescope. He got me interested in the sky, and all of that turned into me doing Coast to Coast. It's amazing, but that all created that foundation that I have today.
Speaking of Coast to Coast, and speaking of hobbies and everything, one of my favorite hobbies is astronomy, and I kind of dabble with amateur astrophotography. I took a really good picture of the moon and Jupiter in occultation.
Cool.
How do you pronounce that? It's a really cool picture. It's my best picture I've ever taken. And there were some nights when I would go out with my telescope. It's a big 8-inch telescope. Turn on Coast to Coast and listen to you taking callers on alien abduction or Planet X or whatever was going on. And I'd be looking through my telescope, just kind of listening to Coast and just picturing how small I am in the universe. And to a lot of people that might scare them to feel so small. But for me, it was like almost a spiritual experience. It filled me with a lot of joy and hope to think about my place on this rock floating around in space. Do you get any of that vibe when you look at the stars?
When I first got my telescope, I looked at Saturn in the night skies in Detroit, and I saw the little ring around Saturn, and it was like a painting up on the sky. It was the most marvelous thing that a little 12-year-old boy could ever see. And I looked at that and went, "This is amazing." And of course, you looked at the moon, and you look at Jupiter, and you could see 4 of Jupiter's moons all around it. It was just a sight to behold, and I was captivated at a very young age, and I still am.
Yeah, I would encourage people to. One of the things about if we're talking about astronomy right now, they get deterred because they think, telescopes are really expensive or it's cost prohibitive to get into. And I'm telling you right now, everybody listening right now, astronomy is not very expensive to get into. You can get into it for free just by looking up at the sky. And you can get in, if you want to get an actual telescope, you can get a telescope for probably around $50 or so. And that gets you right into Jupiter's or into Saturn's rings. That gets you seeing Jupiter's moons. So one of the things, George, I do on the show is I encourage people to reconnect with their inner geek. I say we're all geeks about something, whether it's cars or airplanes or space or whatever it is. Connect with that and listen and find hobbies that you might not know that you're interested in. Maybe it's knitting or anything like that. George, outside of radio, what would you say your hobbies right now are? Do you have any hobbies that you get into when you go off the air?
Actually, Johnny, my hobbies are this radio show. I mean, I think it, I breathe it, I eat it, I love it. And to me, that's a hobby. I mean, don't tell anybody, but I would do this for free.
Yeah.
And I really enjoy that. So what I'd like to do is magnify it. In addition to that, we've branched out. I do live stage shows now. I've been doing television programs, Ancient Aliens on the History Channel, Beyond Belief on BeyondBelief.com for a long time. And I've added that to my repertoire of things that I like to do. And I'm just having a time of my life doing it right now.
That's, I would say one of my hobbies is radio too, obviously. And I wouldn't say it's my most passionate hobby. And you and I are lucky enough to be doing that for a living. And again, don't tell any of my bosses, but I do it for free also. So, George, thank you so much for coming on Geek Therapy Radio. I know your time is brief. I want to give you this chance here you've already started to do it, but to officially plug anything you want here.
Well, I love Houston, and I love the people in the Houston area, and just keep listening to Coast, and just keep doing what you do. Love you, folks.
Thank you very much. George, thank you so much for being on Geek Therapy Radio.
Thank you.
Who among us doesn't love great beer, amazing food, and arcade games? That's why I'm stoked beyond geek belief to tell you about Kung Fu Saloon, located at 5317 Washington Avenue, right here in Houston. Kung Fu Saloon on Washington Avenue has the geek trinity covered, and then some. Of course they have the most excellent beer on tap, the nomiest food off the grill, and the vintage arcade games we love. But you can also get your Tay-Tay on with karaoke, your super fan on with televised sports, and your rug cut to the best music and DJs on Washington Avenue. In addition to arcade games, get your competitive fix with Giant Jenga, Giant Connect 4, 3 skee-ball lanes, shuffleboard, and foosball. Get your drink, food, game, karaoke, and dance on. Or step to Street Fighter 2 with me and get your geek fanny served. Hadouken! Kung Fu Saloon, 5317 Washington Avenue. Visit www.kungfusaloonhouston.com for more details and dress code info. Oh my goodness. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. I'd say I'm still shaking. I'm not physically shaking, but my brain is still twitching. From interviewing George Noory, I'm trying to put into words or into relatable context what it was like for me to interview George Noory. Because a little bit more on the backstory. When I was, how old am I now as of recording? I'm 34. So 20 years ago, I was a teenager. And you know what? Honestly, you wouldn't think of a teenager back around the early 2000s or late 90s. You wouldn't think of a teenager turning on AM radio. But for some reason, one night I couldn't sleep, and I didn't want to listen to music. I dug the radio out of a drawer somewhere, and I found some batteries laying around the room, and I turned on the radio, and I just kind of scanned through the channels of the AM radio, because that's where I knew talk radio existed. My dad was in broadcasting. To let you behind the curtain a little bit more for any new listeners who are just following the show, my dad was in broadcasting for almost 40 years. He told me, he encouraged me not to get into broadcasting, which his reasoning was sound. Mass communications is not what it was when he was riding the wave through the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. Basically that entire time period where TV was king, radio was king, and then in the early 90s, that's when Dish Network and those RCA little satellite dishes you've seen on everyone's house, that's when that took over. Once you had 1,000 friggin' channels to choose from, the mass communication wave, as far as being lucrative, let me put that in a little caveat in there. As far as it being a lucrative career, that's when it nosedived. And you don't want to know what your local TV reporter makes. Not the anchor. The anchors are doing all right, but that new reporter you see out in the field, he ain't making a lot of money. And it's really hard to see your friends around you in your mid-20s, early 30s and such, balling, stacking that cheese, making that cheddar, making it rain, while you try to dig your heels in and make something for yourself. And let's face it, a dying format. Radio's never going to go away completely. It kind of has in Europe, but the broadcast and antennas, that's never going to go away completely. And I know. Basically, I've said that this broadcast that airs here on KPRC 950 AM, I treat that more as advertising for the digital aspect of the show. The broadcast is basically the advertising for the podcast. That's why I say, hey, go subscribe to the Geek Therapy Radio podcast, because it's 2018 as of recording. Podcasts are where it's at. So back to me turning on the radio as a teenager. That's not something that most teens you'd think they were doing. Remember, this is late 90s, early 2000s. We got Britney Spears and NSYNC and Smash Mouth and whatever other god-awful late 90s, early 2000s pop rock crap that was out there. Maybe that's why I turned on AM radio. I was like, I don't want to hear people. There's nothing good on the radio musically. Hey now, you're an all-star. Get your game on. Get paid. I'll stop. I just wanted to hear somebody talking. So I scanned through there, a little AM radio, and I found George Noory. I think the first night it was Art Bell, and then the second night it was George Noory. Before George took over for Coast to Coast, it was kind of back and forth. Art did some shows while George was kind of taking over, and then eventually it was just George full-time on Coast to Coast AM, and then sadly recently Art Bell passed away. So I'm sitting there listening, and for those of you who've not heard Coast to Coast AM, which is probably, there's a good chance that you've heard Coast to Coast AM. If you've ever turned on the radio late at night driving around on a road trip or something, you've probably heard Coast to Coast. It's the show that talks about aliens and conspiracy theories and ghost and Sam Squamch and Mothman and all sorts of that. It's just that show. And what make the Philadelphia Experiment, which is what Stranger Things was based off of, more or less. If you haven't heard the story of the Philadelphia Experiment, it's horrifying. Horrifying. But in a good way. Or you've heard, what's that? They dug a pit in, I think, somewhere in Siberia. It's supposed to be a gateway to hell. And supposedly someone puts a microphone down in it, and you hear just the screams and torture of people being mutilated in hell. It's horrifying. And I know in the back of your mind, you're thinking, well, the logical part of you is thinking it's all hogwash. But in the middle of the night, it's like the best campfire stories you could ever possibly listen to. And I'm underselling it. So even as a teenager, it had me pulling the sheets up over my head, scaring me. The old sleep paralysis, not being able to move. You wake up and you're awake, but you can't move. And sometimes there's an old hag, an old lady ghost sitting on your chest, making it hard to breathe. Isn't that horror? Shadow figures hiding in the shadows of your room, staring at you with their red eyes while you sleep. That's craziness. But it was so awesome to listen to growing up. And I know Sarah's probably listening to me in the background here saying, that explains a whole lot why you like weird stuff. But Coast to Coast was awesome. Coast to Coast is awesome. It holds more nostalgia for me growing up than it does currently. Also, for those of you who don't know, I used to work overnight. That was my full-time gig here at the radio station, as I worked 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. And I ran Coast to Coast in Houston. Where I was running the board, KTRH was the Houston affiliate for Coast to Coast AM on the Premier Network. So I spent years, probably 6 years total, working the overnight shift, running Coast to Coast, listening to George full time. And George is the one who inspired me to actually get into radio. I remember I was waiting tables one night. This was 2007. I was waiting tables at the Cheesecake Factory here in the Woodlands. I was a waiter. And I was driving home one night back to my apartment, which I got because my girlfriend wanted me to get an apartment in the Woodlands, and then she immediately broke up with me. That was super sweet. So I hated my job. I was very, very depressed. I don't remember any sunny days from those few years. But I was driving home from the Cheesecake Factory after my shift, and I tuned into 740 KTRH, and I just kept repeating to myself, News Radio 740 KTRH. I just kept practicing that. And I know you're listening to KPRC right now. Don't look at your dial. Am I on 740? No, you're listening to 950 KPRC right now if you're tuning into the broadcast. But I, over and over in the car, I would practice News Radio 740 KTRH. And I would just focus on the pronunciation of every syllable, every consonant, and trying to... I didn't really have the best radio voice. I still don't have the best radio voice. It's not deep and engaging and boomy like Art Bell's was. Or John B. Wells. John B. Wells does the intro to my show, Geek Therapy Radio, which is also cool. Because John B. Wells does the intro for Coast to Coast, it's all come full circle. That's what I'm trying to get across to you. Hearing George Noory, and to some extent Art Bell in the middle of the night, that's what enchanted me as a young man with radio. My dad had done it, but I didn't care. My dad was in TV. He did radio to get into TV. He was an anchorman here in Houston. I never had that desire to anchor on TV. There was a romanticism to radio. There's a romanticism to me talking into this microphone and having it broadcast electromagnetically across this entire region. Houston is a city of 6 million people, and just to know that wherever you're sleeping in Houston, I'm beaming through ya. My voice is in ya, which is really neat to think about. Also, more kind of, I don't want to say romantically, but more, it means a lot to me to kind of think that my dad's passed away, and I know that he would think, even though he advised me, to reconsider getting into radio, I think he thought it was really cool that I did get into it. And I think he would get an absolute kick out of the fact that I'm full-time now and have my own radio show. He would absolutely be thrilled with that. And I like to think that now that I am radiating out of an antenna, that wherever he is in time or space, eventually my electromagnetic waves will get to his little radio, and he'll get to hear his boy on the air. I don't really want to say I'm following in his footsteps, because I'm doing my own thing. I think what my dad didn't realize as I got into it, his fear was, like you said, the mass communication wave, as far as making money at it, is over. It's when really what's happened is it's just changed. I don't think he understood fully the digital aspect. Of course, he listened to podcasts and MP3s and all that kind of stuff, but whereas he went into it, when he went into it in the early 70s, only having one outlet to build your brand, so to speak, I see the myriad of digital outlets as opportunity to build a brand. For instance, a lot of you listening right now probably came from Imager. I went viral the other day when I announced that I was interviewing George Noory, which gave me a lot of hope because a lot of people know who George Noory is. And the demographics of Imager is like 18 to 35 mostly. 18 to 25 I think is the bulk. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's the bulk of registered Imager users. So that's pretty young, and it was very, very nice that young people... Sorry, the cat feeder's going off. I'm recording at the apartment. It was very nice to know that younger people, that millennials, still for the most part knew who George Noory was. Granted, they probably know him from Ancient Aliens and stuff like that on the History Channel. But, yeah, I was planning on talking about actual, like, some geek subjects. But this is a geek subject. This is my geek subject. I'm pulling back the curtains, letting you see behind the veil of where I'm coming from. So there's still room for talkers out there. Just because there's 100 million podcasts doesn't mean that if you are into podcasting or you have something to say that you shouldn't say it. A lot of people have, even from the Imager post, have reached out to me. How did you do it? How did you get from where you were to where you're at today? If one person says, I want to tell, can you give me any tips on becoming as successful as you? And I had to kind of laugh at it because it was innocent. I understand where this person was coming from, but like, I've been grinding at this for coming up on 10 years. And radio is cutthroat. Any sort of media is cutthroat, and you have to deal with so much bullcrap, paying your dues, working overnight. Are you prepared to work 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. for years? I had a marriage come and go in that time. Are you willing to make these sacrifices for what you believe in? What I wanted to do with my brand, with my show, with my voice was bring joy to a world that so desperately needs it. To draw a circle in the sand instead of a line where you can come together in this ocean of politics to an oasis, an island where we come together because conservative or liberal, we all love Legos and Star Wars. That's what Geek Therapy Radio is all about. I have George Noory to thank for inspiring me to start doing radio. And it means the entire universe to me that he gave me 10 minutes to come on my show. It's come full circle. If I get canceled tomorrow, I've done something good. More Geek Therapy Radio coming up. Don't go anywhere. We're going to geek out some more. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. I'm your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. When you are subscribing to the podcast, if you're listening to this broadcast on KPRC 950 AM right here in Houston, make sure you type into the search in iTunes or iHeartRadio or Spreaker or whatever your favorite podcast app. I don't know how many different outlets Geek Therapy Radio has. I think it's on Podbean. People have requested that it come out, that it be available on Spotify and on Stitcher. iHeartMedia controls all my outlets. I'm not sure how that all works, but I can certainly ask to be added to Spotify and Stitcher and TuneIn and all that stuff. But for now, definitely, it's on Geek Therapy Radio with Johnny Hemberger is on Spreaker and iTunes and iHeartRadio app and what else? All sorts of stuff. Just search for it and subscribe to it. And do not miss out on the fun. We're all geeks about something, whether it's bodybuilding or cars or violins or astronomy or knitting or ice sculpting or ice capades. Whatever it is, we are all geeks about something. And I try to hit all sorts of stuff here on Geek Therapy Radio. By the way, side note, house cleaning note. I went through, and the first 30 episodes of Geek Therapy Radio were untitled. They just said number 1, number 2, he, number 3, number 4, number 5. So I went back and I actually titled them with what that show contains. So there's a whole backlog, lots of geek topics, cover so much stuff on Geek Therapy Radio. So also let me know what your geek thing is. Geek Therapy at iHeartMedia.com, geektherapy at iHeartMedia.com. There's a Geek Therapy network of podcasts out there. I am not affiliated with them. You won't hear my voice there. So make sure it's Geek Therapy Radio with Johnny Hemberger. I talked about Chris Hardwick recently in that debacle. And I have to think that unfortunately, there is now a vacuum in this nerd podcast sphere. I know what you're thinking, Johnny. There are so many nerd podcasts, so many geeky Star Wars-y types of podcasts, science-y podcasts. Chris Hardwick being gone isn't that big of a vacuum, but I think the Nerdist was like number 3. Top. There's like Mark Maron and NPR in the Nerdist, as far as definitely in the top 10 of all podcasts ever in history. I like Comedy Bang Bang. Have you guys listened to Comedy Bang Bang? That's a great podcast. Why am I plugging other podcasts on my show? Point is, I've talked about Chris Hardwick, so I've delved into some deep stuff. You won't, listeners to the radio station, you haven't heard that on the broadcast because it is explicit. I use unsavory, non-FCC approved words in there, not because they are my own words, but because I was quoting Chloe Dykstra's story verbatim. I was just reading her accusations. I read that post she made that went viral. That's a whole mess. But it's there. It's called, that version of Geek Therapy Radio is called Midweek Geek. I usually release something about the midweek, just one segment's worth of Geek Therapy Radio called Midweek Geek. So point is, subscribe. Let's get on to some nerd topics because I haven't talked about anything specific yet on the show. And first thing that pops to my mind is the rumor mill has started churning about the new Samsung Galaxy Note 9. It launches August 9th. And I'm just going to come out and say it. The Samsung Galaxy Note 9 is just AKA Galaxy S9 Plus Plus. Let's just call it that. I have the Galaxy S9 Plus. It's an outstanding flagship phone. And I have no doubt that the Samsung Galaxy Note 9 will also be outstanding. You remember when, this is kind of funny. This has everything to do with it. Do you remember back in maybe mid-2000s, back when we're still using T9 texting? BRB, love, LUV, you, and all that nonsense? That's where all the abbreviated stuff came from. If you're still abbreviating things now, that we have full QWERTY keyboards on our phones and on our phone screens. Grammarly's the worst thing in the world also, by the way. I shouldn't be throwing companies under the bus like that, but Grammarly, you know what Grammarly is like it's not just autocorrect, it's like auto thesaurus, it's auto dictionary, and they had this ad that I saw on YouTube that ran before some whatever I was watching. It might have been Tecmo or 8-Bit Guy or something like that, but Grammarly had an ad that ran, and the guy's typing a resume, I believe. No. He's typing something to some company. It doesn't matter. He asked his girlfriend or his wife, "Does this sound like me?" And the whole pitch was that Grammarly doesn't take away your personality from how you write. You know, when I write stuff, I have a personality in what I write. Everyone has a personality in what they write. So how can a service that auto-corrects and auto-dictionaries and auto-context and auto-syntaxes everything you type even sound remotely like you in the end? Because here's why I say that. Please forgive me, because I'm not usually so catty, but if you write like a dumbass, that's your character. That's how people know it's your writing. If you misspell a ton of stuff, if you write you instead of you, and you don't punctuate, and you don't use proper syntax or context, or who or whom, or he and I, or me and I, or whatever it is. If you're using Grammarly, that's not you anymore. It's unorganic. I would rather take the flawed. Learn to write's all I'm saying. Most of you went to college. Learn to write. How could you get through college? There's engineers and there's very smart people out there who write like trash. How did you get through 4, 5, 6, 8, whatever years and still write like you're in 3rd grade? How is that possible? and again, it's not a knock towards people. It's a groove. It's something you settled into. We've kind of gotten lax in how we communicate for the most part. So I understand the role Grammarly plays. It's just, it's icky in the same way that some singers think autotune is icky. Except with autotune, it's still your own voice, you know? You can still tell that it's that artist singing. With Grammarly, it changes it so much that it's plagiarism, straight up. I argue that it might be borderline plagiarism. And if I was a college professor and I got a paper that was obviously written by Grammarly, I think I would have, here's how you solve it. Here's how you solve it. Let me revolve it. I think if I was teaching a English comp class or something in college, whatever, I would have every student handwrite a one-page essay about anything, about something they know a lot about. I would have them write a one-page essay in their own handwriting. I don't care about the handwriting. And I would just keep a file. This is how this person actually makes sentence structure. This is how they actually spell things. This is their actual syntax. So that when they hand me a paper, pretty much auto-generated by Grammarly, I'll say, did you write this? Or did that freaking robot write this? Did I tell you how I feel about Grammarly? Let's get into it. I'm just kidding. Don't change the channel. Facebook has ditched. If you remember back when Facebook was going to put up this network of solar-powered autonomous airplanes into the atmosphere that was going to bring an internet connection to the entire world. Basically, it was going to be a cutoff man, for a baseball term. It was going to be a cutoff man between the ground link and a satellite in orbit. It was to provide basic internet coverage to encompass and blanket the entire Earth. I think that Facebook put it, bring the internet to 5 billion more people. Okay, I don't. That was a very. I thought at the time that's a neat idea, but Facebook has, and Google has Google officially bowed out. I don't know if Google is officially bowed out, but Facebook definitely has permanently officially bowed out and ceased operations, ceased research and development on these autonomous atmospheric satellites, as they called it. Why? Because as big as Facebook and Google are, they don't have the, let's say, expertise and resources the same way that established aerospace companies have. So Facebook, for sure, Facebook officially has just said, you know what? We're not dumping any more money into this. Boeing or Grumman, or is Grumman still around? I don't know. SpaceX, because I know Elon Musk wants to put a bunch of mini satellites in orbit and do the same thing, basically. Starlink, I think he called it Starlink. So anyways, Facebook just bowed out. Yeah, you know what? No, we're not going to do that. Facebook has been in hot water recently. As you well know, they've already put out their BP-style apology video. So has Uber. Have you seen those? I'm the new CEO of Uber, and we're going to operate ethically from now on. Facebook's done the same thing after Mark Zuckerberg stood before Congress. They released a thing. We take your privacy. We'll get back to the roots of social media. Remember when Facebook was you had to be a student of a college, and Facebook said, for instance, Johnny Hamburger is, and you can only type like four words. Johnny Hamburger is really regretting Taco Bell and vodka right now, or whatever. You could write a short little blurb in there. And like one of the downfalls, I think, of social media and kind of a new beginning for society to kind of to deal with was when Facebook said unlimited characters, write whatever the hell you want. That ushered in a new era, and we're just now in this Trump era. I'm not saying anything political, but it's called the Trump era. We're figuring out how to deal with unbridled free speech. Free speech, by the way, is guaranteed to you by your government, not by your employer, and not by society. You can get punched in the mouth for what you say. We'll be right back with more Geek Therapy Radio. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some actual tech stuff. I got off on a tangent about Grammarly and Samsung and stuff like that, but we'll be right back with more Geek Therapy Radio. I'm Johnny Hamburger. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. Johnny Hamburger, mental curator. Some quick hits before we get out of Geek Therapy Radio this week. The next shipment of NES Classics hits stores today, and I say today, Friday, if you're listening to the podcast. I release it on Friday, so Friday, June 29th. Sorry, I had a hiccup. By the way, listeners who don't know yet, a hiccup is a hiccup and a burp. We've all done it. Own it. The new NES Classic next shipment is available today. So I just call it the Nerd Black Friday. So if you show up at your GameStops and your Think Geeks and your Best Buys, be sure that you are wearing your... If I went down there, I would make sure I'm wearing my glasses with the strap going across the back of my head, because it's about to get geek physical. So just be careful out there. Nintendo Switch has always been advertised and always been marketed as both a portable and a home console, which it is. I have a Switch. It is phenomenal. It is amazing. But I thought the other day, I wonder how many people are like using it mostly in handheld mode. How many people are using it mostly in console mode? We around here, Sarah and I use it mostly in console mode. But as it turns out, Nintendo's done a study. I don't know how I do know how they collected the data. They can tell when it's docked and undocked through the data they've collected behind the scenes of you using the Switch. They said it's about 50-50. It's about even for people using it in handheld mode and console mode, but it varies wildly from user to user. So one user like me might use it 90% in console mode, 10% in handheld, while another user, probably a child, uses it mostly in handheld mode versus console. So that's interesting, and it's interesting that it kind of lands right in the middle. I kind of suspected that it would be as such. Remember that Uber driver it's not an Uber driver, it was that self-driving Uber car crash that hit that lady and killed her? Remember that from a month or so ago? Turns out the human being in that driverless Uber car, you could see her in the video looking up and down at her laptop or at her tablet. Turns out she was watching Hulu. She kept glancing down at... What's on Hulu? A show. Did Sunny in Philadelphia go to Hulu? Do I need to get Hulu? By the way, side note, because of the Switch, Hulu's the only streaming service on Switch right now. And Netflix says we have the APK or whatever. We have Netflix. It's for Switch. Nintendo just has to throw the Switch. Sorry, that's a bad pun. But it's true, Netflix has it, and they're just waiting for Nintendo to say, all right, do it. But Nintendo wants you playing the games right now, for good reason, because the Nintendo games that are out right now are great. What else? What else can I kind of tug at? Kroger's going to start using automated delivery, drone vehicles to deliver your groceries. So our streets are going to be clogged with more autonomous vehicles. No, they're not clogged now. What did I just say? We're still decades from it being clogged with autonomous vehicles. There's more complex organic molecules being discovered on Saturn's watery moon, Enceladus. Am I pronouncing that right? Yeah, Enceladus. That's right. More evidence for organic material and possibility of life down there under all that ice due to geothermal heating. NASA delays again. The James Webb Space Telescope launched in 2021. Can you stop putting a number on this thing? This has been delayed so many times. Stop putting an actual date on it anymore. It'll launch in 2021. You know what? The technology is going to be outdated at this pace. And we're going to be stuck with Hubble. Nothing against Hubble. That is OG. But anyways, that's going to do it for Geek Therapy Radio this week. I'm Johnny Hamburger. I've been your mental curator. Hopefully you love the show. If you love the show, please share it. Please be good to yourself and be good to others. Let's spread some joy in this world. Let's come together and celebrate our geek things. That's what this mission is all about. So if you love Geek Therapy Radio with Johnny Hamburger, please share it with all your friends. That would be so great. I don't want your money, just to share the show and enjoy it and love each other. Thank you so much for joining me this week. I have been Johnny Hamburger, your mental curator. That's going to do it for Geek Therapy Radio. Have a great week.